Hey, everybody, welcome back to the next episode of the podcast. This podcast is going to be covering the Bill of Rights, and a later edition will cover the other major amendments to the Constitution. But today, I just want to focus on the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. We talked about in class that to amend the Constitution is not an easy thing to do. And in fact, the last time we had an amendment was in 1992. Um, Before that, it was in 1971. So typically, you're looking at a 10 to 15 year average in our country on when we have an amendment. Basically, an amendment is a change to the Constitution. Our founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, and the famous phrase is from Thomas Jefferson that the Constitution belongs to the living and not to the dead. So they created a way to actually amend the Constitution and to change it. It changes with the times. Unfortunately, it may not change quite fast enough, and we'll look at that here in just a minute. Basically, there's two ways to propose an amendment to the Constitution. One way is each House of Congress, two-thirds of each House, has to approve that amendment or propose that amendment. Rarely happens. You know, we've looked at the differences in Republicans and Democrats. Same thing here. You know, if the president wants an amendment to be passed, such as gay marriage, Congress would not approve that right now in 2015 because he does not have the two-thirds majority vote in each House of Congress. That's very unlikely to happen. What's more likely to happen right now would be your national convention called by Congress at the request of two-thirds of state legislatures. If the government of two-thirds of the states say that we need to have this convention, Congress has to call it to propose the amendment. It's more likely than number one, but again, very unlikely that at this moment a major amendment would be added to the Constitution. Amendments to the Constitution have to be ratified, so they have to be agreed upon. And there's two ways that they're ratified. One is by three-fourths of the state legislatures, and the other is ratified by three-fourths of specially called state conventions to ratify and agree to those amendments. Again, we haven't had an amendment to the Constitution in 23 years. I don't see an amendment coming anytime soon, but I do think there will be amendments within the next 5 to 10 years to the Constitution. So when our founding fathers created the Constitution in 1787, they ratified it in 1787, they clearly explained how our government should operate. But what they didn't do is provide freedoms from the government for people like you and I. So in order for the Constitution to be ratified, all 13 of the original states had to agree to it. Well, most states had a problem with the lack of rights for individuals, so they said, we don't want to agree to this document. And in fact, we're not going to agree to it until you have a Bill of Rights included. People like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, people who are involved in this process convinced the states to go ahead and ratify the Constitution as it was, the first 7 articles, and the first thing they would do is go back and add the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. And that's what they've done. So when we talk about the first 10 amendments and the Bill of Rights, these 10 amendments provide freedom for citizens like you and I from the government. And they have a historical context behind them, which we'll talk about as we go through all 10. So we'll start with the First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees you the freedom of religion, speech, press, rights to assemble, and rights to petition. The framers of the Constitution purposely would have listed religion first here because that's how people started coming to the New World anyway, is because they wanted free religion. You talk about the Puritans and the Pilgrims, they came here for free religion. Free speech. A lot of times in our country today, we feel like free speech means we can say whatever we want to say, when we want to say it, to whoever we want to say it to. That's not true. When it says free speech, that means free speech really against the government, that the government cannot restrict our speech. It's come to mean a few different things as time has gone along. Um, but, I cannot run down the hallways of the school screaming the word fire, fire, fire. There's a fire, everyone get out, when in fact there is no fire and I've just made it up. That does not cover me under the First Amendment. I cannot do that legally. Um, what I can do is speak freely about the government. I can give you my opinions on Congress or President Obama. That's not an issue. Some issues that have come up with free speech lately. Uh, there's two terms that I want you to become familiar with, and those two terms are slander and libel. Slander and libel. Let me move these over so you can actually see the words. Slander and libel. While you do have the right to free speech, you don't have the right to lie in order to damage someone's reputation. So slander and libel are pretty much the same thing. Slander, however, is if you tell a lie that you know is not true with the intent of damaging someone's reputation. You verbalize it. That is slander. Libel is the same thing except it's printed. So libel is a lie that you know is a lie, and you have printed something in like a newspaper, a report. You print something with the intent of damaging someone's reputation. A lie. It has to be a lie. You can actually take people to court over slander and libel. If you feel like someone has slandered your name, they have lied about you with the intent of damaging your reputation. They have verbalized that. Libel, they print it. In a court case, libel is going to be much more easy to prove than slander. Libel would have a record of what was written. Slander, there would not be really a record. You're going to have to take somebody's word on what was said. So a lot of times when you read the newspaper, you'll see that the newspaper has made corrections about certain things. That is so they do not get taken to court for libel. That happens a lot in the print industry where they get a threat of libel. Slander is going to be very difficult to prove because you're going to have a recorded conversation, or you're going to have to take somebody's word on what they said. Another issue that has come up with First Amendment rights, especially free speech, is the internet. What speech is covered on the internet? If you get on, let's say, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, etc. If you get on these websites and you post things that are not true about someone else, that could be considered libel. And in fact, when I said I expect amendments to be coming, these are things that I expect to be covered in amendments. What does the First Amendment protect on these social networking sites? You've got to be careful about what you post on these social networking sites, especially when it comes to First Amendment issues and freedom of speech. The internet is a different animal than print media in terms of newspapers and pamphlets and things like that. The internet, everything that's put on the internet is saved into a database. And all the police or all the attorneys have to do is look at your IP address and they can see everything you've been on. So, it's a very tricky area right now. I would just recommend that you be careful about what you're putting on these websites. You can be taken to court if you spread lies on these websites about an individual with the intent of harming their character, damaging their reputation. You can be taken to court for libel. So be very careful about what you're doing on social media. You need to be very aware and responsible on social media. First Amendment also gives you the right to assembly. That means that you can hold like a political rally. The Martin Luther King Jr. March on Washington, that would have been an assembly. Freedom of press, I forgot that. Freedom of press, You have the right to print things in newspapers, news stories, what's going on. You have that right, and you have the right to petition. You can actually write a petition to the government, and if you have enough signatures on it, they have to address your petition. And I think the number is 100,000. A couple of years ago, there was actually an online petition started to deport Justin Bieber, and they actually got the number of signatures required to have action on that, and it did go to the desk of the president. I think he probably just let the issue die. Amendment 2, the right to bear arms. Again, this has a historical context. The original intent was you have the right to bear arms during a time of war to protect yourself against invading soldiers, because the British had obviously invaded the United States or the colonies. Unfortunately, our founding fathers left this one very vague. And now the debate is, well, what arms were they talking about? Were they talking about handguns like this, a shotgun like this, or were they talking about an AK-47, semi-automatic rifles, missile launchers? What arms were they talking about? You've got to remember that back then, the only guns they had were the single-shot muskets. So they didn't anticipate all of these semi-automatic and automatic weapons we have today. You know, and if you read the news, you'll see a lot of shootings going on in our country. Newtown, Connecticut comes to mind. The theater shooting a few years ago with the Batman movie comes to mind. Columbine High School in 1998, huge ordeal where someone had a gun and came into the school and shot people. So while I don't anticipate this amendment being overturned, I do think there will be more clarification on what is exactly meant by bearing arms. What arms are we talking about? But Amendment 2 does give you the right to own a weapon, a firearm, not actual bear arms. Amendment 3, you have the right to refuse soldiers into your home. Prior to the Revolutionary War, we know that in Boston especially, with the Quartering Act, people were required to house soldiers in their homes. If they knocked on the door, by law, you were required to let that soldier come into your home, feed them, they would take your bed, your nicest bed, give them a bath, take care of them. Well, people didn't like that. So now you have the right to refuse if a soldier comes to your door and asks to come in. This typically applies more to peacetime. Wartime is a little bit different, but we've never had that issue. So just know that you have the right to refuse if a soldier comes in to your home. You can refuse them from entering. Which, you know, a question always comes up in class. Well, what if my brother is in the military? Can I refuse him to come in my house? I guess the answer is yes, but he's your brother. You probably wouldn't do that. And also, you probably don't own the house you live in right now. Whoever owns the home is who can refuse that soldier to come in. So your parents probably would not refuse your brother to come in. So our Amendment 3 is in response to the Quartering Act that King George and Parliament placed on American colonists before the Revolution. Amendment 4, search and seizure. This one always gets a lot of debate in class. Pretty much Amendment 4 says you have the right to not be subjected to unwarranted search and seizure. Pretty much what that means is if the police come to your house and want to search, they have to have a warrant for a judge. You can tell them no, they have to have a warrant. The thing is, all they have to do is go to the judge's house and get that warrant signed, and then they can come right in. Police are very smart. They're not going to come to your house without a warrant. And if you refuse them to come in, they can very easily get that warrant. So right now, what I'd like for you to do, I'm going to pose a scenario to you, and I want you to pause the video and think about how you would react in this situation. let's say you are driving down Louisville Road here in front of the school. You get pulled over because you were driving 65 miles an hour. The speed limit is 55. You were driving 65. You get pulled over and you roll the window down when the officer comes to your window and he smells alcohol. As an officer of the law, does he have a right to search your vehicle at that point? Pause the video, think about it, and then unpause. So the question was, you've been pulled over for speeding, but when the officer comes to your car, there's a smell of alcohol coming out of the vehicle. Does he have a right to search your vehicle without a warrant? The answer is yes. And we call that probable cause. He would have probable cause to assume you have an open alcohol container in the car. You've been drinking. So he would have the right to absolutely search your vehicle without a warrant. He has probable cause to assume you have been drinking and you might have an open container in your car. We call that probable cause, and that's huge. If there's probable cause, he really does not have to have a warrant. A warrant is more for your home when they come search for things. Here's another question for you. I'm going to pose this question to you, and you pause the video and come up with an answer, and then come back unpausing. If Mr. Cloyd or Mr. Adamson come to you, pull you out of class, and ask you to open your locker so they can search your locker and search your things, what can you say? Can you say no? Why or why not? Okay. The question was, if they are asked to search your locker and your belongings, can you refuse? The answer here is no. You cannot refuse from having your locker searched in school. The reason why is because that's not your property. You rent the locker from the school. The school has a master key anyway. They're pretty much just giving you the courtesy of letting you know they're going to search your locker. Even if you say no, they'll search your locker. And also, one thing to consider here is those of you listening are a minor. You're under the age of 18. And when you come into the school, you do forfeit some rights because we have to have an orderly school here in order for people to learn. So you can say no to Mr. Addison or Mr. Cloyd, I guess. They're going to search your locker anyway, and they'll probably call the SRO from the high school over to come search through your things. It's in your best interest just to go ahead and let them search. Amendment 5, rights of an accused person. Amendment 5 provides several different freedoms, especially if you've gone to court. And those freedoms include you have the right to the grand jury. You have the right to not be tried for double jeopardy. What that means is if I go out and steal a car, I've now committed grand theft auto, just like the video game. Or maybe I've been accused of stealing a car, grand theft auto. I go to court. They find me not guilty. A year later, I'm accused of stealing another car, grand theft auto. While I have committed the same crime, I've committed it 2 different times. I can be put on trial for both of those incidents, but I cannot be tried again for the first case. I was declared not guilty. Once that happens, you are not guilty. You cannot be tried again for that crime. That same incident. You can be tried for the crime again if you commit it again, but you can't be tried for that incident. The Fifth Amendment also provides you the freedom to not incriminate yourself in court. If you are asked a question in court, you have the right to refuse to answer that question. You can plead what's called the Fifth Amendment. You can plead the Fifth, and you do not have to answer that question. Now, obviously, if you plead the Fifth Amendment, I'm not going to answer that question. It looks like you're guilty. So you will see a lot of times people will plead the Fifth. Their lawyer will direct them to where they don't have to answer a question that's asked of them. Also, with the Fifth Amendment, you have to be charged with a crime within 24 hours of being arrested. So, as you get arrested, they have 24 hours to read you what you're being charged with. Otherwise, they have to let you go. And that does happen sometimes where people are brought in and there's nothing on them. They maybe have been a suspect, but there's no evidence to suggest they're involved. They're never charged with a crime. So after 24 hours, they have to be released. And then also, the government can't take your home um, if unless they pay for it. Eminent domain, they can't take your property. Um, a lot of times, you'll see that a new road has to be built, and the government, maybe that road is going to be built where your house is. The government will come to you and your family and offer to buy that land from you at market value. Um, you have the right to say no, but if you do, they're going to take your land. They're going to take it forcibly. So it's just best to go ahead and accept that they're going to take your land. But you do have the right to keep your house. They just have to pay for it. Amendment 6, you have the right to a fair and speedy trial. That's pretty self-explanatory. Um, and a lot of appeals come from this amendment because people will argue that their case was not fair, so they'll appeal the decision. Don't be fooled by this word speedy. Just because you've been charged with a crime and you have a court date, your case may not be decided for a couple of years. You go into the line, and when they get to your case, now you're up. But this also deals in fair trials. So if you go in front of a jury, that jury is supposed to have no knowledge of you, no knowledge of the case. They're supposed to be a mixture of people, very diverse group. So it is fair, and both attorneys actually have to decide on the jury. Both attorneys agree. So, typically juries are very fair. But Amendment 6, the right to a fair and speedy trial. This also would include your Miranda rights, the Sixth Amendment. So whenever the police arrest you, they have to read your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. And that comes from the Sixth Amendment. If you're ever being arrested or you're ever talking to the police and they start reaching into their pocket, you might as well just turn around because they're getting ready to pull out their Miranda rights and read them to you. The Seventh Amendment, you have a right to a trial by jury of your peers when it is a civil case. So if it's a case not involving a criminal action, it's involving two parties, you do have the right to a trial by jury. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail and punishment. This is a hot button issue in the United States right now because we've had suspected terrorists in a prison called Guantanamo Bay for several years now. And one of the ways that we get information, or the CIA gets information from these people, is by a technique called waterboarding. I won't get into the details, but pretty much waterboarding means you are making someone feel like they're drowning and they're going to spill information. So the Eighth Amendment protects you from cruel and unusual punishment like that. While these suspected terrorists are not citizens of the United States, they are going to be tried in a United States court. So the thought is, well, if we have an amendment that protects against cruel and unusual punishment, how is their trial going to be fair? Because we've already violated Eighth Amendment rights here. This gets very tricky. No terrorist has been put on trial, really. Not many of them. They're just sitting in a jail or in the prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Excessive bail, you cannot be put 5 years in prison for a speeding ticket. That would be excessive bail and punishment. So you are protected from that. There are different levels of crime. You have misdemeanors, which are small crimes like speeding, uh, jaywalking. You also have felonies, which carry a prison sentence. So murder, grand theft auto, tax evasion, those are felonies. Um, so you're not going to go to prison for a misdemeanor. You pay a fine. That's from the Eighth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment gives you individuals rights, even though they're not listed in the Constitution. Um, for example, the picture we looked at in class had a picture of an airplane. While the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, does not say you have the right to fly on an airplane, you have that right. So there are things you're free to do regardless of that they're not in the Bill of Rights. You have those freedoms. You have the right to go to the mall on Saturday. You're free to go to a movie. You can travel down to Tennessee with your family. Those are rights that you have as a citizen, even though they're not listed in the Bill of Rights. The 10th Amendment grants rights to states. Pretty much what the 10th Amendment says, if the Constitution does not give a power to the federal government, it is reserved for states. For example, there's no line in the Constitution that grants federal government the right to establish schools. In fact, the word schools is not even mentioned in the Constitution. So, since that's not delegated to the federal government, the Constitution did not give the federal government that power. That is a power that has been reserved for the states. We'll get more into that when we talk about federalism. But, like declaring war is written in the Constitution. That would be a delegated power to the United States. Issuing licenses is not listed in the Constitution. Therefore, it is reserved to the states. We'll get into that when we talk about states versus federal issues. When we talk about marriage, gambling, things of that nature. So, with that, I believe that is the last slide for today. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you bring some questions to class, and we'll see you next time.